Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. It's our pleasure tonight to welcome Sarah Stewart Taylor and her wonderful new book, A Distant Grave. Our autographed copies are they're still at Sarah's, but in theory, they'll be transiting to Scottsdale, the Poison Pen, tomorrow after Sarah signs them for us. So we thank you for that. And normally we would show you the book and the signature inside, but this is my advanced reading copy, so too bad, she'll just have to wait. And joining us is Carlene O'Connor, who writes the really popular Irish Village mystery series, wonderful cozies, and who has some news she'll update us with about other projects. So Sarah, I asked her because in her biography, it says she is the author of the Sweeney St. George mysteries, and they rang a distant bell. So I'm going to ask Sarah to refresh you on the Sweeney St. George mysteries before we move on and talk about the Maggie Darcy mysteries. This is the second of the two Maggie Darcys. So Sarah.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having us. And Carlene, it's so nice to virtually meet you. And I'm really excited to talk about Ireland and Irish books. So I live in Vermont, and the Sweeney St. George Mystery Series is very New England, just drenched with New England history and settings. And the first one, O Artful Death, introduces my art historian sleuth, Sweeney St. George. She's an art historian who specializes in funerary art. So she studies gravestones and funerary objects. And, as she's poking around cemeteries and museums, she often encounters dead bodies. So that's, there were 4 in that series. And then I sort of had a little hiatus, a baby-induced hiatus. And during those years, I wrote kids' books as well. So I have a series of adventure novels for middle grade readers that I wrote during those years. And a few years ago, I just was, really dying to get back to crime fiction, and had this Irish story that I wanted to tell, that I'd been really wanting to tell for 20 years. And that's where The Mountains Wild came from.
Well, the 14-year gap is explained by the 3 babies in 5 years or something, which would be enough to slow anybody down. I absolutely love graveyards. I have been to many, many historic graveyards. And I think, and certainly Carlene, if you're writing about Irish villages, you're going to have been stumbling around in graveyards too.
I love graveyards, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the art, gravestone art is really interesting, but so are the messages, that are carved. We took a cruise up the west coast of Ireland. It was a very small expedition ship. It couldn't have been last May, so it must have been 2 years ago. And we went from the Scillies, and then we went up and all around Ireland, eventually got to Dublin. But in some of those Western Isles, there's some really interesting little tiny churches with, sepulchres inside them. And then graveyards, and some of them are very old. There's some ruins, prehistoric ruins up there. So that was really great to see the different kinds of art and messages. And you can trace. Are you into genealogy, either one of you?
Yeah, I was just going to say that cemeteries are fantastic for tracing your family history. You can, in Ireland and in other places, that's often where you go to kind of figure out the family relationships. And I actually, on my last trip to Ireland, I was doing some of that, tracking down some family members.
Well, even if it's not your family in a graveyard, you can often trace somebody else's family, just by checking out the tombstones and seeing how close they are together. And I like the trends in funeral art. it's almost like fashion. To see how things change. So The Mountains Wild. Carlene, you're reading The Mountains Wild. So
it piqued my interest when she said I got this idea. I would love to hear how the idea came about. I am in the middle of it, and I really, really like how Sarah uses time in the book. So I feel like I'm getting almost 2 mysteries at one, and she does such a good job, because sometimes when authors play with time, you might kind of get into one section, and then there have been times, with other books, I'm like, oh, I don't want to go back in the past. I just want to keep going. But she just does it so well that it almost in one way it feels like one story, but you get to see the characters, you know, from when they were there first in, you know, 1993, I think it was, and then flashing to the 2016. I just love how she handles it. And I just feel like I'm right there back in Dublin and back in pubs and back in having crush on Irishmen. And you know, there's so many characters I'm attached to. I'm like, I hope it's not them, because I'm nearly finished, but I'm also thrilled to have A Distant Grave to go to. But if you don't mind, Sarah, I'm like, my interest was piqued when you said you first, like, how did this idea come to you? And did it all like the past and future, did that come at once, or was it just a grain of an idea?
Yeah, so I'm excited to talk about that. And then I want to ask you exactly sort of the same thing. I want to hear about where Siobhan came from, and where, you know, I have a lot of questions about her origin story as well. So I lived in Dublin in the mid 90s. From the time I just graduated from college, and I sort of just moved over there very impulsively, and worked for a bit, and then ended up going to graduate school. And so I was living in Dublin sort of from like 93 to 96. And so I was a 22-year-old like Maggie in Dublin in 1993. And during those years that I was living there, the first couple, or I guess really just the first disappearance of a woman in what has now come to be known as the Vanishing Triangle happened. And just this incredibly tragic, awful series of disappearances. The writer Claire McGowan has recently done this really interesting Audible book looking at these disappearances, and I think she just does a terrific job researching and delving into these cases. And so the disappearance of an American woman was very much on my mind. And obviously I was sort of this young American woman living in Dublin, and taking a lot of risks, as you do in your 20s.
Yeah.
And I felt incredibly safe in Dublin and in Ireland, but these cases were sort of out there. And I really started to think a lot about the families, and what that would be like to have a loved one disappear and to not know for 20 years what happened to them. And so that was really where Maggie came from. I wanted to explore that experience. And so I came up with this young American woman who goes over to try to help find her beloved cousin when her cousin disappears. And then sort of asked myself that question, 23 years later, new evidence is found. Maggie has, in the interim, become a homicide detective, and she goes back, and what happens? So that's,
there really is like a different kind of horror, right, involved when someone's just missing. And like in the book, her father Danny, and just the pain and the years of unanswered questions, because I keep reading like, this is a murder mystery. I'm like, oh wait, but we're not sure like what happened to her. So you're kind of giving us both, because they are finding the bodies of other missing girls, but we're starting to wonder, is Erin, part of what happened to these girls? Did the same thing happen to her? So I really, like, you do such a good job of keeping us like not able to sleep, Barbara, until we find out what is going on here. So like I said, it's so exciting to have like a second waiting. Are there going to be more? Is she going to continue?
There are. I'm just finishing up the third one, which is actually set in West Cork. So I've, I had one just before the pandemic. I was over and was able to do, the research that I needed to do.
That's funny. I was too in the fall of 2019 with my father. Maybe we're passing each other different places.
That's funny. Yeah. So yeah, I did a lot of, I did all the towns and villages along the coast. And then I was, my crawling around in cemeteries was where my Irish relatives were from, which is sort of more inland, closer to Bandon. So that was really fun. But so, I would, if it's okay to ask you, I would just love to know, it feels like you kind of conceived of this community and all the people in it. Just, it feels like it's sort of came just whole cloth, and I'm sure it didn't. I know how much work goes into creating that, but can you talk a little bit about yeah, where did Siobhan and her family and her friends, like, how did they sort of arrive in your imagination?
Yeah. Well, the town of Kilbane is based on Kilmallock, County Limerick. And my ex-boyfriend, he's a good friend now, took me, that's his hometown. So my first visit to Ireland was his hometown, and I fell in love with it. I didn't know you could fall in love with a town, right? So I didn't know I'd be writing this series at the time, but I was still writing and soaking everything in, and just loved it. So when the project came up years later, I immediately knew, like, oh, I felt so happy. I'm like, I get to set it in Kilmallock, but I wanted to change the name, and I even moved it up to the Cork border instead of Limerick, just because I didn't want these wonderful people in the town to think I was actually killing them off. So I thought it'll be a little easier to fictionalize the town. And then Siobhan, you're right. Like, sometimes as a writer, you're like, how did that start or come to be? I think definitely she has part of me in her, as part of my redheaded mother in her, probably part of my Irish grandmother in her. And then she at first was alone, and it was my editor who said, I want her to have more of a family. And I'm really glad he had that suggestion, because now I couldn't imagine her, without the siblings in the book. Yeah, and that's what's fun about a series. And I was going to ask you, like, when you started The Mountains Wild, did you know it was going to be a series?
I didn't. I really didn't. I sort of had this one story that I wanted to tell, and it felt very complete to me. And when we sold it, I was chatting with my editor, and she said, do you have any thought that this could be a series? Can you, what do you think? And I think I immediately said, nope, it's done. And then as soon as I hung up the phone, I mean, this is sort of always the way it happens. As soon as I hung up the phone, it was like, oh, well, what if she, and then what if this? And within a day or two, I'd kind of spooled out this future for her in Ireland. And, I think that's sort of the big question is, where will she be? And the second book is actually sort of partly Long Island and partly Ireland. But, how am I going to get her there? And how am I going to, that was part of my thinking, I think. And I just started to have all these ideas for how I could do that. And I'm so glad my editor asked that question.
Yeah, I love that, because there are so many times, like, and as somebody who writes cozies, there's often all these challenges you have to face, right? You want it to be realistic, but in a cozy mystery, you're not going to have too much violence on the page, and so, like, you're always thinking of ways to make it believable. And so I, like, was part of your challenge the fact that Maggie is a detective in America, and so now how would she have any rights or jurisdiction, and you were able to really make a believable reason in the first book because of her personal connection. So was that part of the challenge? Like, okay, how do I keep this going and have an American in Ireland solving murders and still have it be believable?
Absolutely.
I love that you rose to that challenge, because to me, that's the excitement of writing. So yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I was just going to say, you hit the nail on the head, that I think that really was my challenge. And in the second book, I really wanted to show her, sort of before I take her someplace else, I wanted to show her sort of at the top of her powers and, like, fully deputized to do her job. And so she catches the case on Long Island at the beginning of A Distant Grave. And she arrives at the crime scene, and there's this man who's been shot on the beach, and he has no identification. They can't figure out who he is. And as she starts to really look into him, she discovers that he's Irish, and that she doesn't know why. No one knows why he was on Long Island. And so she's able, sort of, in her role as a homicide detective on Long Island, she's able to do this sort of cross-Atlantic investigation to try to figure out who he was and what he was doing there. And looking to the future, I'm sure you do the same kind of research on, GARDA procedures and protocols, and I've been doing a lot of research on how an American detective, how an American law enforcement professional can become qualified to practice, to work as a detective in Ireland. And it's really interesting, and it's kind of, research I think is so much fun when it sort of suggests new plot points and storylines, and that's been really fun, actually.
Yeah. And have you been able to actually talk to or interview Irish guards?
I have, yeah, and that's been great. That's really key.
Yeah, I hope to do more of it myself. I think I had like one phone conversation. It was hilarious because he didn't want anybody to know he was talking to me, so he didn't want his name mentioned. And he was very lovely though, and had a nice phone conversation with me. And I didn't want to like overstep, but I'm always like, oh, I wish I could call him back, but just keep as many notes as I can. It would be kind of great to follow them around. I know they're busy, but I know in America, a lot of writers do that, right? They have police academies, and you can go to the police academy and learn everything you need to learn. And it's just a little more challenging, and especially when, as a writer, you want to get it right and know all your facts, and you're dealing with kind of another system.
Yeah, there's a different, I think because it's perhaps because it's a national police force rather than our local police forces here, there is a sort of different attitude about, I think about, I mean, and probably to being an American crime writer, makes it even tougher because I think there is this feeling of, not wanting to, just being afraid that something will be taken wrong, or, I don't know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I was noticing too, and Barbara, if I'm talking too much, feel free to put me down there. But I was noticing, kind of your love of the language in the first book by giving maybe American readers who wouldn't know the Irish pronunciation of some of the words, the way to pronounce it, which, I know readers find really helpful, because I kind of struggled with that. And because my characters in the Irish Village are all Irish characters, there wasn't really a comfortable way to, explain how to pronounce things, and readers were kind of left to do that a little bit on their own. So, but is part of it too that, like, I don't know, part of my love of Ireland is the accent and the music and the poetry just in the language itself. And I kind of felt that you feel obviously the same way as I was reading it. I mean, all the senses are there for us, the smell and touch and taste. Like, it's so good, Barbara, isn't it? Mountains Wild, just love it.
It really is. Yeah, I know that Sarah's publisher gave it a big push. I can always tell by how many advanced reading copies arrive at my door. It's more than one. They're really being serious. They were very excited about it, and I was too. I'm trying to remember her name. Here we go, Patrick. I'm doing it again. Her name is Erin, and there was a wonderful Minnesota writer. Can you recall her name that wrote?
Oh, Erin Hart. I love Erin Hart.
And I loved her books. And she too had, an American in Ireland archaeologist, and gave her a chance to explore Irish history and, Irish sites more out in the country, because, in order to dig stuff up, it's kind of hard to do it in Metro Dublin. But I love those, and I thought that nexus, but ultimately to try to straddle two countries in a series, I think is extremely difficult. I had a very nice visit last week with an author from Crooked Lane who's writing antiques. She's fallen in love with writing British mystery, but her character is an antiques dealer from Ohio, and then there's a British policeman who's going to be the romantic interest, and so. You can kind of go back and forth for 2 or 3 books, but ultimately you're going to have to make a choice, either, I mean, for a series to continue, it's just not realistic. And the pandemic has brought that home to us. So a really commuting relationship, unless you're like, zillionaires with private planes in the whole bit, is extremely stressful. And if there are children involved, it gets even harder, or family. So, I'm glad to hear that you are, moving in the direction of taking Maggie to Ireland, because I don't know how many credible investigations you could come up with that span Long Island and Ireland. I mean, maybe Boston, maybe if you relocated her to the Boston PD, there would be something closer. But So it makes more sense if Ireland's where your heart is in this.
Yeah,
as
no,
opposed to
and I
Long
think
Island.
for her, I think part of the second book for me was, wanting to show her sort of at the height of her powers, and then to explain why she would leave and why she would move to Ireland. And so, without giving too much away, the events of the second book are, is sort of the one thing, like what happens is kind of the one thing that would make her consider. And you'll have to read to find out what that is, but yeah, I think going back and forth, you're right, you can do it once or twice, but you need a community. I mean, just as Carlene sort of creates these communities around her characters, I think readers love that sense of the main character's home, and that you come back to these familiar characters when you open up the next book in the series, and that that you're kind of seeing not just your main character's journey, but the journey of all these people around him or her, so yeah.
Well, the community is important, but if you're going to have a police protagonist, you do have to face up to the realities of jurisdiction, as Carlene's pointed out. And if she's a cop in Long Island and not a cop in Ireland, she can't continue to be a cop if she moves to Ireland unless there's a way for her to go about that. And sometimes people choose career over romance, or choose career over location, and that's an option for her, to decide. And this book is that pivotal point. But Carlene has finessed that by having everybody in her Irish village, right? So you're not stressed out by about that. Although you can bring visitors to the village, which is a great device if you're writing about a small place and you don't want to knock off the entire population. Then then you bring people in. Ireland also has a practical, it's a welcoming country to people who immigrated from Ireland and now want to come back. There have been various plans, I think, or they make it easy for descendants of Irish families in America to come back to Ireland. And they make it a nice place for writers. Ireland, if I remember right, is a tax haven for writers. There's no income tax if you're a writer.
For artists of all
Or
kinds.
maybe it's even broader, not just writers, so there's some definite financial advantages. And then of course it has a great history of, there used to be, and I'm not sure it's in the same place, a terrific writers museum in Dublin where you could go, a house. And then in Limerick, if I remember right, Carlene, there's a hotel that was famous for hosting Irish authors. And in the bar, there's, large photographs of major Irish authors and all. So it's a very welcoming country for writers, and there's some hard boiled. Ken Brune in his Jack Taylor series, set in Galway, is very dark.
Yep.
There's a definite noir or hard, well, they're different, noir and hard boiled strains in mystery written by Irish writers.
Oh yeah, there's so many wonderful Irish writers who are writing, I think, in that space right now. I love Declan Hughes's novels, are just terrific. And then
even John Banville tried, adopted Benjamin Black as a name, but that was 1950s Dublin, if I remember. It was almost like Raymond Chandler, but in the 1950s.
Yep.
So yeah, Patrick is actually, Patrick, join us. You're the person who knows more about Irish writers than I do by a whole lot. Patrick's our resident Celt. So
I don't know about that.
Chime in, kid. Who are we missing here? Besides, we've been through Benjamin Black.
There's so many of them.
Don Connolly. Lord, what am I doing?
Yeah, well, there's a whole new kind of generation too, of like Jane Casey and Eva Dolan. Some of the ones up in the north are really fun too.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's so many great Belfast writers.
Yeah.
Stuart Neville and
Adrian
and of course-
McKenty, that Sean Duffy series.
I love the Sean Duffy series. The Claire McGowan, who I mentioned, has a great series.
And Liz Nugent, wasn't her book
Nugent,
set in
yeah.
Dublin?
Is just an absolutely stunning writer, I think. Her her book.
Ingrid Black. She hasn't done a lot recently, I don't think.
No, and then there's some very good Irish historicals. Peter Tremaine, I think he's on like book 37 or something of Sister Fidelma. I've read them all.
I love Joe Joyce. Have you read, Patrick, have you read any of Joe Joyce's?
No.
They're set during World War II in Dublin, and they have this great like sort of spy spy crime crossover, and they're really atmospheric. And
Joe Joyce.
Yep.
Any relation?
I don't know. We should ask him.
And then we have a talk.
Carter. She writes mysteries in Ireland too. I met her at a conference. Andrea Carter.
Oh yes, I like hers. They're great. They're set up in Donegal, and her character's great.
Oh,
and they're
wow.
not mysteries, but I love Colin McCann and Patrick Murray. I don't know. Skippy
Brian
Duncan.
McGilloway is really good.
Brian McGilloway is very good.
Yeah.
He's up for, I think, a Glass Bell Award. And then we were talking before we started this Zoom meeting about Bartholomew Gill and his absolutely fabulous Superintendent Peter McGarr mysteries. I thought those were absolutely brilliant. A lot of them had a literary, some sort of literary connection to them, right, Patrick?
What about John? Remember John Brady?
I do remember John Brady.
What was his character? It was Matt
Minogue.
Yes. Those I
were
really
really
liked
good.
those, actually. Those were really good.
Those were excellent. In one of them, he brought African. There's a very right-wing church African population in Dublin. I think they're from Nigeria, if I remember right. And one of his books talked about that, about the it wasn't really about the racial clash. It was about, do you remember that, Patrick? It was
No.
about it was about
was that Caddish in Dublin?
Might have been. It was
Kaddish
about
in
the hard
Dublin. That's
line of
something
the
else.
church. But I don't think it was Kaddish in Dublin. I think it was another one. But that was the first time I thought about what it would be like to be an Irish immigrant an African immigrant in Ireland. And then that was reinforced when my husband and I were traveling in Sweden and Norway. And there was a significant African immigrant population in both countries. And, if you're the contrast between, the Scandinavian look and an African look is really dramatic.
That's why I love Thin Lizzy, the mixed race Irish rock band. You don't see much of that. That's great.
What's it called?
Thin Lizzy.
Oh, don't even know.
They had an African American Irish or African Irish, I suppose, lead singer and frontman named Phil Lynott. Very famous. Yeah.
Well, and there's a lot of good Irish television and, Irish storytelling. Who was it? Maeve Binchy. Maeve Binchy was one of the, a huge best-selling author forever. She wrote more like women's fiction than she did mystery. And she lived into her 80s. It was really, has a huge body of work, if I remember right. And then isn't Patrick Taylor who's writing a whole
Irish Village.
Yeah, and they're too, Carlene, they're Irish Village, but they're not mysteries.
I have actually also, he has a cookbook from the series, and I also have the cookbook, and it's a lot of fun to look through. So
Right, and then over in this country, we have Rhys Bowen writing an Irish immigrant story with Molly Murphy, and with her daughter, there's a new one after a long hiatus. It's coming out. We'll be doing the launch for it in March when Rhys gets back from the cruise she booked before she knew what her pub date was. So we have to kind of finesse the date. But and that's a really good series. And at one point, Molly goes back to Ireland. I don't know if you remember that because she left under difficult circumstances in one of the relatively early books. She goes back. Which was, I think, probably really traumatic for
Sarah. Did you ever go to Glendalough?
Oh yes.
What a wonderful cemetery.
So there is a wonderful cemetery there, and the Mountains Wild is set sort of in Wicklow and in Glenmalure, which is just over the hills from Glendalough, and I've actually spent quite a lot of time there, and I just absolutely love that part of Wicklow, and I've done a lot of hiking there, and it's just I love it.
Yeah,
Driving in
cemetery.
Ireland is,
I'm sure you've spent time in Glendalough as well.
I actually haven't, so I'm like not gonna have to remember and write. That's one area I haven't. I've been a lot, but that's why I need to keep constantly going back. I want to get everywhere. I think in November I'm going to try to spend the month in Dingle, just because I have a project that'll be set in Dingle. But this is why I need to keep going back.
oh, the Dingle Peninsula is absolutely wonderful. I have a hilarious photo. I mean, it is a photograph, actually, a colored photograph back in my coffee bar of is it the Basket Islands or Blasted or whatever it is?
Islands, yeah.
Right, you know, which are like this, and it's sheep and they're practically vertical. They're going up and then they're going down, you know, because the road is like that. And I mean, driving in Ireland's a really terrifying experience if you're out in the country. It's one thing on the motorway, but for Americans to drive those little tiny roads with the, you know, the walls on the wrong side of the road, and the whole bit.
These massive lurching tour buses,
Oh,
like
man.
hauling ass around these, like in Kerry. When we went there, it was in 1999, and it was like we picked up our rental car in the middle of Dublin and busy, you know, and it was just like we're trial by fire. It was pretty harrowing.
You know, it's funny because the trip I did in 2019 was, you know, even though I had, you know, lived there and have done many trips over the years, it was the first time that I had rented a car and driven alone. You know, I'd always sort of been with, you know, friends had driven me, or I'd been with my husband and he'd driven, or I'd taken buses. And so, but there were just all these places I wanted to go and that I had to drive, and I was alone. So I got my car and I got out of the airport just fine. And I was heading to Wicklow actually for the first night. And on one of those tiny little lanes that just, you know, it had been wider and then it went down, I just misjudged and hit the curb and blew a tire. Like I mean, I landed like an hour before. But I was so proud of myself because I negotiated the whole thing. I got to a service station. I got it fixed. I got, you know, so it was actually like a good trial by fire. And then I set off on my journey, and it was, you know.
Yeah, we kind of circumnavigated the country. We started in Dublin and went down to Cork, over to the, you know, Dingle Peninsula and all that stuff, up to Shannon, up through Donegal, up to the north. It was great. We didn't really go into the interior too much, but then we ended up in Belfast and then Newgrange, which was spectacular.
Yeah.
Well, the interior can be wonderful. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I have circumnavigated Ireland several times on various cruises. I've been in Belfast more than Stuart Neville, perhaps, you know, I mean, often, but interior Ireland is wonderful. You know, Carlene, one of the things that I remember, the interesting thing, because you're writing about villages, is there's a tendency in a lot of countries, you know, to keep an historic village. I mean, amazingly, there's an historic Norwegian village in the South Island of New Zealand because there were lots of Norwegians there. And in Sweden and Norway, you can do that. But in Ireland, there's one. And what I remember most clearly is peat, the smell of peat, because, you know, that's what they burn for fuel. And it's a very powerful smell, and the entire place was permeated by it inside the houses and all. So, you know, I think that's not anything we're much familiar with in this country. We don't have significant, well, if we do have significant peat, we're not cutting it up and burning it. So have you thought about, you know, bringing something in some way to do that, you know, a visit to an older village or something? I mean, they're
and I know in Murder in Irish Cottage, they went to a smaller village, and I know I remember the smell of peat was there, because I think not only is it a unique smell to the area, I think for so many Irish people too, it's like the smell of home, right? It's like
Sure.
that comforting, you know, and it does kind of bring that village to life. But that's another reason I want to go. And I'm so jealous of Sarah because I'm afraid of driving even here. I just have one of those unreasonable fear of driving. I think because I spent 15 years in New York City, so I didn't drive.
Yeah.
And also I'm intimidated now to drive in Chicago. I'd be fine in a small American town driving or what have you, but the thought of like driving on the other side of the road and all the horror stories I've heard, just my heartbeat picked up when Sarah was talking about it. It's like, good for you and changing the tire, and that's a great adventure to have. but that's I wish I could get over that, or I'll just have to find, so far I have been lucky, Irish friends drive me around, or when my father and I were there in 2019, we took buses everywhere, which actually that was great too. And it was funny with the sheep, we were in Connemara and I have friends in Roscommon and they were going to come meet me. And then literally she texted me and she's like, oh, we can't, the sheep are going to be blocking it for hours. You know, like we won't be able to meet you. So
They're all
it's
spray
true.
paint. They're all spray painted these bright colors, you know?
Yeah,
But
to differentiate
kinda
what
cool.
farmers
Yeah.
I'm
wanted.
sure there are professional drivers that you can hire. My husband and I made a decision some years ago when we got lost for the second time in Japan and being totally unable to communicate, read the map, orient ourselves. Even the GPS was in Japanese, for God's sake, you know, so we were completely adrift. And I said to him, our new rule is going to be that if we can't speak the language and read the street signs, we're going to hire a professional driver.
It's a good
We're
rule.
not going to muscle through this. And so we've done that in Turkey and other places, you know, where it just really would have been difficult. And it takes a lot of stress off, you know, to be able to do that. And so
I
you might
guess
think
you
about it.
used to be able to hitchhike very
Yeah.
safely in Ireland. You
Yeah.
know? There were a lot of
In
kids doing it.
1993, when I was living there the first time, I did a lot of hitchhiking, and it was just everybody did it.
Right. There were
Um,
still in 99 a bunch of kids doing it,
Yeah.
you know?
So Sarah, if you're going to, I mean, obviously Carlene is sticking with the village format, at least for now, but is Maggie going to be more urban? I mean, if she's going to be a comp and so forth,
Yeah.
are you going to land her in Dublin or Galway or one of the big cities?
Yeah, so her love interest lives in Dublin and works in Dublin, so they'll be they'll be in Dublin, and I love Dublin. There's just so much to it. I think the changes over the last 20 years in Dublin have been really really extreme, Dubliners would tell you, and really interesting. And there's still so much of what I remember from 1993 that you can find in sort of little pockets. And then there are parts of the city that just feel like a completely different city. And I'm really interested in that. I'm really interested in those, all the wonderfully new people who are making Dublin home. There's, I love learning about, just about all the immigration and the new communities that have sprung up since I lived there. So that's all. I mean, I think there's just a lot there to work with.
Well, you've got Trinity College, you've got, some serious academic. Yeah, there's a lot to write about in Dublin. I agree with you, but I think an urban mystery feels very different than a village mystery, and since she's coming from Long Island, not New York, it's actually a move towards more urban for Maggie.
It is, yeah. And, I think there are opportunities because Ireland has a national police force, and there are these functions that the Garda sort of sends out to investigators in the smaller towns and villages sometimes, or even in other cities. There are opportunities to kind of move investigations around.
Yeah, Deborah Crombie had that design for her Duncan Kincaid and Gemma series, and the earlier books, they were, because he's with Scotland Yard, they were in various locations in England. It eventually became London centric. But for a long time, you got to explore a lot of interesting places around Ireland, and so there definitely you could do that. Carlene, do you think a village mystery is largely going to be the same, whether it's in Ireland or England or Scotland or America or France or Poland or whatever? Are the dynamics and the design of the village mystery kind of universal?
I think there are definitely some similarities. Just getting to know a close-knit cast of characters and getting to know the community kind of as part of the fabric of those characters, and everybody knows each other, which can be good, when people have to band together to help each other out, but it can be bad when people know each other's secrets or want to know each other's secrets. For me, though, I would have a hard time setting it in any of the places you mentioned, because I think you have to be able to feel it as an author. And when I was first approached to write the series, my editor actually asked if I would write a series set in England, but the same type of small village in England. And I was just honest right away. I said, I wouldn't, I spent a week in London, like that's the extent of my England experience. And I just knew I couldn't do it justice. And there was a pause, and I said, but I could set it in Ireland, and kind of just off the cuff. And then when he accepted, then of course I was terrified, and then I was thrilled, and just all that range of emotions. But for me, like, it would only be Ireland, because that's the village I would want to live in, ideally, or in kind of the alternate universe type of world. And also that's why I made it fictional, even though for inspiration it was based on a real town. I wanted to be able for the village to kind of take on its own life or personality. And so that's been an exciting part. And I find myself just as attached to the series, sometimes as other people. I'm really excited about Murder on an Irish Farm. That's February's release, because there's so much happening for the family and characters, like really major changes that I think are going to be exciting for the rest of the series. So it's just wild. Sometimes I sit around and find myself, thinking of them as like people separate from me, which is, I think all authors kind of experience that at some point. You click into a book and it's like bigger than you are. It's fun when you finally reach that point.
Right. So you're going to be writing something new in addition to the Irish Village Mysteries. Are you going to try your hand at something less cozy?
I am, and I'm really excited. So I'm going to be starting a second series set in County Kerry, in the Dingle Peninsula. And this is now going to sound like the opposite of what I just said. It's not going to be a cozy. They are going to be darker murder mysteries. But the reason that it's an interesting mix is that the protagonist is still an amateur. She's a veterinarian. So she's a small town veterinarian, but it's just not under any kind of cozy label construction. My editors said, look, do whatever you want with it, and we're not going to market it as cozies. So we're actually naming each book in the series off of an Irish quote. So the first one is going to be called No Strangers Here. And it's from the Yeats quote, there are no strangers here, only friends you haven't met yet. So Dimpna Wilde is the protagonist, and she kind of has a complicated family history between her father, who is a prominent veterinarian, and her kind of tarot card esoteric mother. And she's 45 and she's estranged from them, but the mother's having an affair and the victim turns up dead and killed from a veterinary euthanasia medication. And the father, who's a very kind of powerful figure, is the number one suspect, but he also has dementia. So Dimpna doesn't even know whether her father or not committed this murder. And she has to go back home. She lives in Dublin in the opening, and she has to go back home to Dingle to take back over the family veterinary practice, but also to try to either clear her parents' names or figure out like who killed the man they call the dancing man in that area. So it's just so exciting. But I have a lot to take on, because first I'm just like learning about the veterinarian aspect, and then the aspects of Dingle. And like, I don't know if you felt the same way, Sarah, but like when you start like the first book in a new series, it just feels like double the work, because I can't even get to the mystery so much until I know who these people are and their relationships. But I'm also really, I'm excited about both series, and they feel different enough that I'm not worried, so I'm worried about writing them both at the same time. I know my Irish Village characters so well that they kind of do that work for me. But it's exciting to get to know other characters as well. So thank you for asking about that. I'm taking on a lot, but I'm excited. I've been talking to an Irish veterinarian. He gets the spirit of it, because I was like, okay, I read that release is euthanasia. Could it kill a man? He goes, oh, it could kill a man. For a large man, you'd need like 100, 50 milliliters. They come in 100 ml bottles, but he's not going to just stand there while you poke him with a syringe. Now, if you really want something that strikes the fear of God and veterinarians, and I'm like, I do. And so he's been so helpful, and he gets like, he gets it as, you know, what we do and the spirit of it. Instead of saying, why are you asking me which of my medications can kill a human? I save animals. He was right there with me. So, and he has a great memoir himself, like called Whiskers, Feathers and Fur, about animals and his job traveling. I think he's from Wicklow, actually. And it's just his memoir is fantastic, all the characters and the animals. So I'm kind of hoping to have both, like a really good dark murder mystery, but also these, you know, wonderful characters and going out to farmers' homes and the animals. So I've taken on a big challenge, but I'm hopefully up for it.
It sounds wonderful. And you can do the same thing in Dublin, Sarah, you know, because there, as you pointed out, there are different communities in Dublin.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's fun to think about the possibilities. And
then
yeah.
there's a lot right around Dublin. I mean, you know, it's not suburban Dublin, but Ireland's not a very big country, so you can actually get practically all over Ireland fairly easily.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think too that having my character, you know, she's an American, she's an outsider in Dublin, and so she has this sort of, I mean, she has an interest and perhaps an ability to kind of, you know, connect with other people who are outsiders, and I definitely see that as kind of a direction for the series. You know, Dublin is such an incredibly international place now. It's, you know, it's really, from the, you know, the location of so many tech companies, you know, main European offices in Dublin. There's just, you know, there's just this real international flavor. And
we didn't even bring up Tana French, you know, who is very much the, you know, modern Iron. I wouldn't call her noir, would you, Patrick? You know, but she's definitely on the darker side.
Yeah.
She writes different books. I mean, you know, you can't really categorize her as any one thing, because while she's had some repeating characters, she's also written some standalones.
Right.
But so it sounds like between you, you know, you're going to give us a lot of. Have you run into any criticism that you're an American writing about another country? Have you run into that sort of objection?
I mean, I think because I've been fairly explicit about, you know, I'm writing from the point of view of an American, and I'm not taking on the point of view of Irish characters. Probably not, but I expect, you know, I expect at some point I will. I'm sure I'll misstep somewhere. But you know, for now, I like, you know, I know what it is to be an American in Dublin and sort of experiencing Irish culture and thinking into, there's this interesting thing where you sort of have to think in two versions of English. And, you know, that the American character in her head is thinking trunk, but when she's speaking to an Irish person, she has to say boot, you know, and you sort of, there's this interesting translation that goes on in your head when you're, you know, when you're an American there. And so I'm really, I want to sort of keep using that, I think, as a way to address those concerns.
Did you find yourself acquiring a lilt?
No,
accent?
no.
When you were living there, you didn't?
No, you know, it's funny. I think if you have an ear for music, sometimes that happens to you. And I have anyone who knows me will tell you that I have sort of the worst singing voice you could ever imagine. So none of it rubbed off on me. But you know, I have heard of that happening to people if they have a really finely tuned ear.
And your character Maggie, though, has a beautiful singing voice. And
she does, yes. I gave her the thing that I wish I had. we often do that with our characters, don't we?
Yeah.
So Patrick, are there any questions from the audience?
Let's see. I've tried to hit them up for questions. Lisa Holstein says about Sheila Connolly. She mentions her.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. Yes.
She says that Sheila had a body found in a peat bog in one of her books.
She did.
Yeah.
Like Aaron Hart. Aaron Hart also had a body found in a bog.
Yeah.
Let's see, what else here? Let's see. Maybe the pen could make a list of all these Irish authors. Okay, Debbie, we'll try to do that. I think I can come up with most of them. Let's see here. No real questions, just people that say they love both of your books. Well, here's one for Sarah. You already kind of touched on this, but she says, Anne says, Sarah, I really enjoyed The Mountains Wild and look forward to reading your latest. I was introduced to your writing a couple of years ago when I read Oh Artful Death, which was another excellent book. Why did you stop writing the Sweeney St. George series? And you kind of talked about that, but
Yeah, I mean, I wish there was a more mysterious and reason I could say, well, I was, off doing secret missions around the world. But in fact, I was early parenthood kind of threw me for a loop, and I was a bit overwhelmed for a while. And then it's hard when you've been away from a series for a while. It's kind of, I'd love to get back to Sweeney at some point, but it's kind of hard to, sometimes it's hard to get it going. And, and I think there's something too about wanting to start something new and really embrace that. So, we'll see, but thank you for reading those.
and The Grave snuck its way into the new book. So,
Oh yeah. Right, exactly.
I haven't even touched upon Irish Spy. Daniel Silva wrote one book that's not a Gabriel Allen. It's an Irish
Marching
season. The Marching Season. Jack Higgins was Irish, and there were some books along those lines. And then Daniel has a character. One of his books does take place fairly recently in Ireland. So there's one of the great early spy stories was written by an Irish author. So I think there's a whole huge embrace of different kinds of stories that that you can tell about Ireland, whether they're historical or whether they're cozy, or whether they're police procedurals, or they're noir, or they're espionage. It's a very rich, for such a small place, it's very, very rich in communities and in inspiration, and it has such a wonderful literary history. It really does. Great writers. I would love to make it a project to bring the Bartholomew Gills back into print. Penguin had them forever. And I think, Patrick, we should lobby for them, because, even though they're older now, the things he wrote about really haven't aged. You can still be excited reading about, Gulliver or some of the things in the books. So I love that. Anyway, it's been wonderful to talk to you both. If there's nothing else from the audience, we should probably wish you a very good evening. And let me encourage people to order a signed copy of it. And if you haven't read The Mountains Wild, forget about a signed book or whatever, just order a copy and read it as a paperback, because it's a really wonderful book.
It really is. It really
As
is.
Carlene points out, you have the comfort of knowing that there's another book waiting.
Another one's waiting.
And one I'm finishing up. And Carlene, I'll be looking out for your new series. It's really exciting.
It's such a thrill to meet you. I'm very excited about your project. Congratulations. Happy book birthday.
Thank you so much. And good luck with everything. It'll be fun to meet you in person, hopefully sometime once we're.
Yeah.
Well, we'll try to do that. I think it would be, we're missing having live people at the store, but the other advantage of Zoom is that we can bring people together from quite a distance that might not be feasible in terms of a live thing. So we're gonna keep it. We're gonna keep Zoom and still have live events, and the live events will be videoed to Facebook anyway. So it'll be, it was what we always did, but I think it's an exciting prospect to go forward. We've made a lot of new connections. I was asked yesterday if I would like to do the launch for Lord Jeffrey Archer, and I thought that was never going to happen until Zoom. And when I wrote the publicist back, I said that, and he said, "You're right." He said, "It's wonderful. We can do things with our international authors that were not ever going to be feasible." Yeah. And I was thinking back and thinking, wish we'd had Zoom when Dick Francis was still alive, or Colin Dexter. There were a number of authors, Patrick, we never
Reginald Hill.
could get to the store, but if we'd had Zoom, we could have done things. Jeffrey Archer and I are both in our 80s, so I want to catch him before it's too late, but and I'm so pleased that we have this. That's the only good thing that's come out of the pandemic, is that we've had this opportunity with this technology that the pandemic accelerated, to do all these exciting things that were not going to happen before. So
Well, and thank you to the people at bookstores who have made them possible. It's
Yeah. Love bookstores.
it's a lot of work setting them up and organizing, and
but it's really fun. And this is, and it's also, you talk about exploring new opportunities in books. It's really exciting to have a different way, I mean, this is our 31st year. And for 29 years, we did it more or less the same. So, it's been really interesting to branch out from a set pattern and invent new ones. I found it really interesting. Our whole staff has adapted pretty well to it, haven't they, Patrick?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's been great. Anyway, as I said before I waxed off, as I often do, thank you very much for joining us. And Carlene, wait, one last thing. What's the little book that's coming out in August? What's it called?
Murder in Connemara.
And it was what? It was a Barnes & Noble special, and
It was
now
a
it's
Barnes &
been
Noble
launched.
exclusive for the first year, and now it's having its wider release at the end of July.
So it's a paperback coming up.
Yes, there'll be a paperback.
Right. And so it will be one you haven't, it's not a new title. It's going to be a book that you haven't read before. So you have so many fans. I'm sure they will be delighted to know about it. Right. Okay, everybody. Good night. Good evening.
Good
Thank
night.
you
Night.
all.
Slancha.
Right.
Lunch.